and the S-Bus.
I thought of Hugh the moment I read the remark of Madame Blavatsky to W.B. Yeats. I used to wonder at and pity the people who sell their souls to the devil, but now I only pity them. They do it to have someone on their side. Hugh was the first person I noticed when I began to be invited to Oxford parties. He always seemed to be there, however much the other company changed. He had hair most beautiful in colour, a sort of burnished gold which attracted notice from a distance. It shone in the street a quarter of a mile away like an invitation from a heliograph, and as you walked towards him, he was marked out for scrutiny, even in the middle of a crowd. He was at his best, in sunlight, at a distance of between 400 and 330 yards. His hair, in fact, held such promise that by the time people met him face to face, they were angry at having been hoaxed. Everyone who met him for the first time was disappointed. And his teeth were very bad. They were dark brown towards the root, and there was some argument about whether their colour was predominantly yellow or green, and whether their texture was harsh, furry, or slimy. Yet there was no doubt how bad anyone with a hangover felt when he said, "I feel like Hugh's teeth." All this inhibited Hugh because he liked meeting people, and yet he could sympathize with how they felt when they looked at him. If there was a mirror in the room, he kept turning round sharply, trying to catch himself not looking so plain. But he never did. He was an unhappy youth. I was surprised that he should be invited to so many parties, because he himself rarely entertained. Yet there he always was, sipping his cocktail and talking in a rather solemn way, like a 19th century imitation of the 18th. He posed a mystery that I did not particularly want to solve. His conversation was not brilliant, yet it was strangely stinging. It could bring me out into a psychological nettle rash hours or even days later. The first party which I held gave me a clue to his apparent popularity. I hadn't asked him because he had never entertained me, and I never wanted him to, but he was the third person to arrive. He scarcely troubled to feign surprise. "Oh," he said, though he had never called on me before. "You're giving a party. I'm awfully sorry. If you'd only told me, I'd have kept away. Now you've come, of course you must stay." Later in the evening, another guest arriving said, Well, Hugh, so you managed to gate crash in the end?" Hugh looked across at me, saw that I had heard, and winked at me in complicity against our host. I winked back, and only later remembered that the host was I. I thought at first that Hugh, because he was not a very attractive person, got more enjoyment out of parties than people whose private lives are more satisfying. He wanted company because he had small chance of winning love. But as he developed the habit of dropping in at odd and even inconvenient times, I found there was more to it than that. He looked around any room he entered to see who was there who might be useful. He regarded it almost as a professional right. After a while, I began to realize that Hugh's primary interest was simply to be involved, to be in on the action. One instance will serve to illustrate this. A group in my own college approached me to join a study circle in ritual magic, and though I didn't like the idea, I agreed. But one thing I was certain of after our first meeting. Listening to papers which were an inaccurate digest of the anthropologists I had read was a waste of time. To say so would have been arrogant, and when it came to my turn to read a paper, I looked round for a means of breaking away. There was a chance of writing a paper on incubi and succubi. There were some girls from Somerville in the group, and it would have been possible to make the paper obscene enough to have bust the group for good, because they were emotionally as prim as they were intellectually broad-minded. But they were nice girls, and I didn't want to cause them embarrassment. For the same reason, I rejected a paper on the incidence of supernumerary nipples amongst witches and warlocks of the 17th century compared with those of conscripts in the First World War. It could only have put an end to the futile group by being so crude that it wouldn't have been funny to write. so there was only one choice. When asked the subject of my paper, I said that the time for theory was past, the next stage was practice. The coven would meet in my rooms that day next week for its first practical. This was an enunciation of a tactic I had recently evolved. Sauter pour mieux reculer. As soon as I left the room, I heard the women's voices raised in protest. With any luck, I thought, we shan't even have to have a practical. The next day, a deputation of warlocks came to plead that the time was not yet ripe for practice. The witches felt that they didn't yet know enough. Tell them, I said, that you can no more understand the theory of magic without practicing it than you can understand Freud without being psychoanalyzed. As a concession, shall we say that we don't convene the coven in full Sabbath this time, but just have an informal Elbach? What's that? They asked. Well, you might call it a black matin. Certain that the witches would back out, I was growing overconfident. When the warlocks returned to say that the girls from Somerville wished to be excused black matins, I said, of course, I could easily get some more witches, but I expect you want to call the whole thing off. It'll probably be better anyway. To my horror, they protested that they were most anxious to proceed with the practical work and left it to me to make full arrangements. I was hoist with my own petard. From Mowbray's, I obtained black candles, a packet of unconsecrated wafers, and a number of incense cones, which smouldered sulkily in the unventilated incense burner with a smell like smoking rope. A liturgy in medieval Latin was specially composed by a friend who threw himself eagerly into the ceremony and insisted on contributing the parings of his toenails and other trimmings from his body to be burnt in the incense bowl. Since the ceremony, I was convinced, would be as boring to attend as it would be amusing to gossip about, I arranged that as soon as it had ended, a plentiful supply of gin and sherry would be available to heal the painful memory with strong doses of alcohol. From Lady Margaret Hall was recruited an attractive band of witches to replace the timorous apostates of Somerville, and all was set for a quiet little Esbas which would make our boring study circle disappear like magic. But I was reckoning without Hugh. His curiosity was immediately aroused. But you haven't invited me, he said. We've got too many men already, I answered, and anyway, even though it's only a bit of nonsense, it's probably just as well that a Catholic like you shouldn't be mixed up in it. Both the excuses were valid, but to a person as sensitive to slight as Hugh was, they carried no weight. He knew that the reason he had not been invited was the usual one. He just wasn't wanted. I believe you're going to celebrate the Black Mass, he said. Don't be an ass. He shook his head gravely and went out of the room. That evening I was dining at the George, and a dozen people came up to ask if it was true that I was celebrating Black Mass the next day. They'd all got it at first or second hand from Hugh, who on the strength of the story had gained entry to 3 different cocktail parties to which he hadn't been invited. His tactics were infinitely adaptable. He was turning a joke which he hadn't been invited to share into an act of blasphemy which he abhorred, and the social contacts he had hoped to make by joining in, he was making instead by standing out. The harm was already done. Gossip spreads faster through Oxford than round a cathedral close. But I was so angry with Hugh that he should deliberately spread a lie that might get me and perhaps all of us sent down that I went round to his college after dinner. I left him a rude note telling him to come to my rooms next day before lunch. As I poured him a sherry, I said, what the hell do you mean by spreading this silly story about a black mass after what I told you yesterday? When you told me yesterday that you couldn't invite me because I was a Catholic, there was only one conclusion I could draw. There are other conclusions. He raised his glass. Such as? That I didn't want you, I said, and added, people would invite you more often if you weren't so eager to be invited everywhere. Always. He walked over to the window. It may interest you to know that Father Ronald Knox is taking the affair so seriously that he spent all last night on his knees before the altar, praying that you should suffer a change of heart. He finished his sherry and put down his glass. Then he came across to me and said with great solemnity, I do implore you to reconsider what you are doing, for my sake. Why for your sake? He shrugged his shoulders. One is one's brother's keeper. I could bear almost anything but that, Hugh. My scout came in with a roll, butter and cheese on a plate. He set it down on the table. "Will there be anything else, sir?" he asked, glancing at Hugh. "No, thank you," I said. "I am lunching alone." Hugh went to the door. "When, by the way, is it going to take place?" "When could it be, save at the setting of the sun?" "What time is that?" "Look up lighting up time in your diary," I suggested. I never discovered whether it was Father Knox or Hugh who telephoned the Dean, but at approximately sunset there was a knock on my door, and I opened it to the senior porter, who left his winter quarters, the lodge, only at the behest of the highest powers, and then sulkily. "The Dean, won't you?" he said, and then as he was halfway down the stairs, "Toot sweet." I was glad that the ceremony had been concluded an hour previously and all the sabbatical properties cleared away before I was asked to see the Dean. In full session, the black matins might have appeared to his eyes more sinister than absurd. The Dean was famous for his charm and admired for his firm and graceful handling of the indecorous, which he had occasionally to discuss with undergraduates. He asked me to sit down. He gave me a cigarette. He remarked on the brilliance of the weather at the time of the year. I observed that the English climate was so changeable that one couldn't qualify any observation about the weather by the time of the year, because this implied a norm which did not exist except as a meaningless average between extremes. "Are you holding a black mass in your room?" he interrupted with the equivocal expression of a man who is not sure whether the question he is asking is very silly or very serious. I laughed. "Of course not, sir. Not a Sabbath, sir. Merely an informal esbash." "What I wanted to know is, did you have the consecrated host and a defrocked priest?" "No, sir. The only defrocked priest I know lives in Hove, and he's too old to get about much. We had tinned spider crab from Kamchatka and a dry amontillado. Actually, there is some left if you'd like to come up." The Dean brushed aside the offer of the crumbs from the warlock's table. "Then you can assure me that there was nothing sacrilegious or blasphemous about this, what do you call it?" "It was probably, sir, the tamest esbath ever." "I take your word for it," he said, "but I think it would be a good idea if this didn't happen again." "I assure you, sir, there'll be no need for another. This one achieved its purpose admirably." Just as I was going out of the door, he said, "And what was that purpose?" "I suppose you might say, sir, that it was to dispel the depression caused by the hebdomadal conjunction of ponderous spirits." "Clearer, clearer, clearer, the skies were clearer, clearer, clearer. There you lose